Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Aftersun, directed by Charlotte Wells. Before we begin, I want to mention that Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early, and you'll also get access to bonus episodes. Go to nebula.tv/cinemaofmeaning or follow the link in the show notes to learn more. Now, back to Aftersun. Thomas, you had this as one of your favorite movies of last year, right?
That's right, yes.
How did it end up on that list?
I think I had it at number 2 or 3, something like that. This was a film I really loved, and I think one of our most requested movies to talk about recently. There was 2 or 3 people on Letterboxd who were asking me that we talk about it on the podcast. Several folks in our Discord server were mentioning it and asking us to talk about it. Yeah, I think it's one that people are interested to hear about. It's a movie that is very affecting, or at least I found it to be. It's a coming-of-age father-daughter film. Technically, there is a mother in this movie too. There's 2 mothers. That aside, it's a coming-of-age story, which isn't like my favorite genre. I think coming-of-age stories can kind of be overplayed. We've seen a ton of them. We've seen a ton of really good ones at this point. So it's not a kind of movie that I go into super excited about most of the time. But this is a debut film from writer-director Charlotte Wells. And I think what is beautiful about this movie to me is kind of the angle that it comes at this story from, both stylistically and in how it frames its narrative. A lot of coming-of-age stories are obviously an adult filmmaker's reflection of growing up inherently, because mostly we're not getting teenagers making coming-of-age movies. So there's naturally this element of kind of looking back on your life and trying to grapple with or understand or express what you were experiencing at that time from your adult perspective. And I think part of what's really fascinating to me about this movie is how it kind of incorporates that perspective into the film itself. There's this very just nostalgic, not even nostalgic, but just backward view of the story. And it's very much about this kind of process, not just that Sophie is going through in the film, who is the girl who is kind of in the coming of age story, but we're also seeing Sophie as an adult and kind of getting a sense that her perspective on these events in her life is kind of evolving as she is becoming an adult and a parent on her own. So we really get this sense of like, not just the story that's happening to her as a child, but how that kind of narrative is reframing in her own mind as an adult as she's looking back on these things. So anyway, that's what's really fascinating about it to me. I'm interested to discuss it, but first I'm curious what kind of you thought about the film, or what your first impressions were.
Yeah, I didn't get to see it before I made my best of the year video, regrettably, because it definitely would have been on there. I've seen it twice now, and yeah, it might also be very high up on my list of favorites. I didn't rank my movies, but there's a secret ranking in my mind, and this one would be high up there. Yeah. But it's funny that you talk about coming of age stories, because that's not what I immediately thought of when I watched this. I guess it depends a little bit on how you define coming of age stories. I guess in my mind, the coming of age story is really told from the perspective of a child as they mature into the phase beyond childhood, or what the coming of age part that the coming of age title suggests. To me, this felt more like an adult perspective reflecting back on events in the past and how they shaped the person perhaps that is looking back. Yeah. And structurally, it actually reminded me a lot more of movies like The Mirror by Tarkovsky, and to some extent even The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick, which are also these clearly adult perspectives, sort of grasping back in their own past to find some kind of meaning, some kind of explanation for how they ended up where they are today.
Yes.
And I think this movie is more accessible than the other two that I mentioned, but there still is something that felt very powerful about it to me.
Yeah.
And also it is something that's very relatable to everyone, basically. I think everyone has had memories like that are kind of transformed in our mind, and that have us sort of thinking back to what really was and what it all really meant. And there's also just the kind of change in perspective that happens when you grow up and you look back at like the images of your own past, like the literal images like photographs or the camcorder footage, and you come to realize that, oh, you're now moving into that space that you as a child looked up to as a sort of distant concept of adulthood. And so I think that's something that happens in your mid-20s to late 20s, where you really feel like you're now moving into a space that you always kind of pushed ahead of you when you were young.
Yeah.
For example, when I was young, I used to watch a lot of Friends, like the TV show. And then a couple of years ago, I watched it again, or like a few episodes of it. And then I realized like, oh, I'm now the same age as both as the actors, but also as the characters they play. They were even younger, I think, in the first seasons. And so there's a lot of things that as a child you kind of look up to as being in the realm of adulthood. And then it's a weird experience to find yourself transitioning into that and then kind of having to come to terms with the reality of it.
Yeah.
And the same, I think, goes with your own like personal memories. Like there's a few kind of weirdly coincidental parallels between Aftersun and my own life, where not so much like literally, but more the externalities. Like I also went on a holiday to Turkey when I was young, which was, I think it was the first time we traveled by airplane, and we also stayed at this resort, and we had like the same little issues where like there's a booking that didn't go right, and there's like these horrible bus rides from places,
right?
The day trips that you have to get up super early for, and the all-inclusive bands, and the horrible cheesy animation that's offered by the staff. This happened a couple of years earlier, but when I was even younger, my dad had also broken his wrist at some point.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a lot of camcorder footage of him playing with me while he also has his hand in a cast like Caleb has in this movie, which was really funny.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that also had the same sensation where if I look back, a few years ago, I digitalized all the old VHS tapes for my family. And I realized like I always knew I kind of looked like my father, but now like seeing him at roughly the same age that I am now, it's really strange to see just how much I look like him, and to see like your dad grows gradually older as you do. So you kind of, your frame of reference is constantly shifting, but then to kind of have it flip back so dramatically and seeing him in that footage is my age now. I don't know, there's just something strange about it. And that to me is kind of what this movie touches on most directly, that kind of, that kind of weird reconciliation with your own past and with your own expectations from when you were young, and how like relationships have shifted over time and what it all means.
And your own perception of those relationships. That's what I was getting at, where I think this does transcend kind of the normal boundaries of a coming of age story, and it doesn't really fit into that genre, even though that would be the immediate genre that it would most obviously fall into. And I think there are a lot of those elements here where you have a young girl who is negotiating. A lot of the scenes, a lot of the details are her kind of negotiating the boundaries of her age and her identity. And so this might not follow the normal trajectory of a coming of age story. The scope of the film is fairly restricted to this one vacation and then the little bit of context we get outside of it. But a lot of the scenes are her talking with her dad about, he's saying, hey, you can't do that, you're too little. Her kind of figuring out how she feels about her relationship with these older kids, her feeling her way through love interests, like these kind of stereotypical things that we might see kind of in a coming of age story. But then beyond that, there's this other element that you just described so wonderfully, which is well, there's two things that I think break this out of that coming of age mold. That's there, but then beyond it, you have what you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost a second coming of age that I feel like happens in adulthood, which is all the things you just described of at a certain point. I think for a lot of adults, it might happen when you have a kid and then you look at that kid and you realize, oh, my parents were just people like me when they were raising me. And that sparks this realization for people, recontextualizing your own understanding of your parents and being a child as an adult. But I think it can happen without having a kid. Just getting older and seeing definitely images from your past or having certain experiences, just being an adult for long enough kind of makes you look back on your childhood differently or your parents differently or any number of these things. So it's also about that kind of transition that happens in adulthood. I think the other thing that breaks this out of the sort of little tropes of coming of age is we really deeply get a kind of sympathetic view. Callum, the dad, is just as much a fleshed out character as Sophie, as the child is. And they kind of share equal space in this movie, in this story. She's obviously the main character, but I think he's really well fleshed out and we kind of understand what he's going through as well. Or we don't fully understand it, but we get a good look into that. That's a big part of where that feeling comes from, of like, you know, the moment we're inside of perspective-wise within the main storyline is kind of from Sophie's perspective mostly, but there's also this feeling that we're getting like this broader understanding of Callum that Sophie is only really gaining as an adult now. And I think that was really interesting.
Or at least that she's trying to construct about it. Because I think the kind of the premise of the story is that we have this adult version of Sophie who's kind of reaching back into her past, reconcile in a way with a dad that's no longer in her life. I think that's what it said on IMDb. It's not that explicitly told in the movie. As the movie progresses, there's a definite sense that he's no longer a part of her life or might not even be alive at all anymore. And so that to me was one of the more fascinating aspects, that we get to see this image of Callum, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the father. Yeah. But you never get a true sense. You always feel like, is this a real image that we're seeing, or is this Sophie trying to fill in the blanks of her own understanding of things? Because we're looking back, like to me, it felt like there were three sources of information. We had direct VHS footage, which feels like the most objective footage that we get. We get what feel like to be the more objective memories, like these are more traditionally filmed, but these are mostly the scenes with Sophie remembering the memories that she was a part of, like the scenes that she as a young version of herself was in. And then there's kind of the more imaginative or creative shots of mostly specifically of the father without Sophie being present. And these to me felt like imaginative, or like the most unreliable, in the sense of like, are these giving us true information, or are these suggesting Sophie thinks about or is trying to understand her father? That combination I really liked, that because that feels very true to real life in my sense, where you have these snippets of the past that you saved in like these objective artifacts, like footage of VHS footage of photographs. Like for me, there's whole vacations of my childhood that I don't remember if it wasn't for like the pictures photos I still have in a photo album. And even then, like we have like little trips, like a weekend away to Belgium or whatever, and that I literally have no recollection of. Even if I'm staring at the photos, it almost feels like you're staring at someone else's history. But that's something that, especially as I've grown a little bit older, that not something I'm struggling with, but it's something that I've been fascinated by, the way you're not just experiencing a lot more, but you're also forgetting. You're starting to forget a lot of stuff. Yeah. Which, even if you have like pictures and mementos, it's still, you realize the actual memories are getting really blurry. And
Yeah.
I wonder to what extent also maybe pictures help, or maybe even like drive you not just to actually recollect the memory, but instead like almost replace memories with more imaginations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure about you, but when you visualize memories, do you see it as kind of this objective image through your own eyes, like you're watching old GoPro footage that your eyes shot when you were young? Or is it more like, for me, it feels like these more sporadic images. They don't feel like I'm literally seeing through my own eyes. It feels like I'm kind of constructing this mental image of what a place or a time was like. And it doesn't feel like a direct stream of experience, so to say.
Yeah. It depends on what the memory is for me. There are certain very visceral memories that I kind of do have a kind of first-person perspective memory of. But those are rare. And also, interestingly, to your point, those are generally memories where I wouldn't have any kind of photo, anything like that, of the event itself. It's just like me on my own, or there would be no reinforcing material surrounding that memory. But then there are other memories where I think at one point I would have had a more visceral, direct memory of it, but kind of over time, the photos supersede the memories themselves. A really clear example of this is for a while, I remember when I was younger, I had memories from one of my really early birthdays. It was like my second birthday or something like that. But I had memories of like sitting in a high chair and like eating cake, and there being like these little construction vehicles, like digger vehicles in my like cake icing. I had like direct memories of that. I don't have those memories anymore, but I remember having those memories, even though I don't have the memories anymore. But there's also photos of that event. And so now like I can recollect that birthday, but it's from a very abstract, like, I know details of what was happening. Like it's filed away in my history that happened to Thomas. It's no longer an experiential memory. It's a really trippy part of, I think, aging, that you realize as you get older that's something that just happens, that there's just a certain amount of data of experience from the past that will just kind of slip into the fog.
Yeah.
I guess you could be sad and kind of like kick and scream against that, but there's a certain element of just like realizing that and kind of having to accept it as an adult. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, for me too, it's that, and also the way memory is constructed, as not as this direct, okay, you looked at something, now we save that exact image to memory, and that's gonna be like an exact copy. But it's more like, it feels like the way maybe like smartphones take pictures now. They don't take a literal picture, but they immediately do a lot of computing and
compression and
processing. It's like, the weird thing is I have like, it feels like I have memories of myself in third person as well, like that. Even though I know that's obviously not how exactly it happened, but there's I have a memory that vacation I took to Turkey, like there was one day I remember where I was kind of wandering around the edges of the resort that we were staying. And there was like this little guard dog that they had, not like a big threatening one, but like a little small one that nevertheless was, I think it was one of the security guards or something. And he started chasing me. And so I was running away, but I remember at some point I just kind of turned around, I looked at the dog and it stopped barking and it walked off. And I think the reason I remember this is because I thought at the time that, maybe it saw my face and it knew that I was a guest here. And that's why he backed off. And I was impressed by this dog. This was my like 10-year-old child logic. That this dog would memorize all the guests that would stay at the hotel and then know who to leave alone and who to chase after. But for some reason, like that part of that memory, in my mind, it's like I see myself running in third person for like a split second or something, even though I know that's obviously not actual memory. That to me captures a lot of the intricacies that this movie, even just as on its basic presentation level, already presents, and which already makes it so rich and fascinating for me, and also personal in a way that I think for a lot of people was also very personal.
Yeah, I think that's part of why it's so powerful is we're having this whole discussion about memory, but there's never ever in the film itself kind of this explicit acknowledgement of this is about memory. They don't talk about memory, none of this. It's all just communicated through kind of this stylistic presentation that sort of constructs this feeling of fragmented memories. Your comparison to Malick was pretty apt in that this is a very, like, narratively very impressionistic in that we know what's going on. It's not like the scenes themselves are necessarily abstract. We can tell, like, oh, they're sitting down for a meal now and they're having a conversation. But what's stripped away is all the stuff that we're used to from a lot of conventional Hollywood films where it's like, here's an establishing shot. This is what the scene's going to be. And there's sort of like an arc within the scene itself, and then we complete that. It's much closer to kind of what we're used to with a filmmaker like Malick, where you just get a few shots or a piece of a scene that's just a detail about what's happening, or a piece of dialogue, or a small detail, and then it cuts to the next thing. And it's kind of in how all of those things are strung together that we start to build this understanding of not just like the plot of the film and that the events that are explicitly happening, but the feelings, what's happening dramatically to the characters, the feelings they're having is all kind of built up slowly over time through your sense of what was relevant to the character in these memories. Like, why are these specific fragments the ones that are being recalled by the character? It reminds me a lot of kind of the structure and style of Joanna Hogg's Souvenir as well. And there's other filmmakers who do this, but I think it works so well here because it's about, like, it's a movie about memory. And so constructing it in that way, you just get this sense of it. And then even within the scene, you already pointed out the stylistic differentiation between the scenes that have Sophie and don't. There's also, it's not just what scenes were shown that gives it this fragmentary feeling, but also kind of how some of these moments are shot. Instead of getting the most obvious kind of direct interpretation of the scene in terms of cinematography, we're just seeing we might get small sensory details or things that might not seem obviously relevant, but in a lot of ways, that's also kind of how our memory tends to construct these pieces where we might have this sense of like, oh, I remember that person giving me a coin to put into the machine, or I remember when I was having this kiss more viscerally than the kiss itself. I remember the kids like banging on the skylight above me. Like those are the things that become kind of lodged in our memory, and that's sort of how the film is focusing its attention.
Yeah, it feels like a very backwards style of storytelling, instead of like saying, I'm going to tell this story and now I'm going to think of the scenes and how they progress into each other. And this feels more like, I think you described it in one of your old videos in Terrence Malick as where the camera is sort of searching for meaning instead of already having a premeditated purpose or meaning in mind that it's communicating. Instead, like this whole movie to me felt like Sophie reaching back into this part of her past, like this memory of this vacation, in search of clues or meanings or moments of significance that might reveal more about her father, essentially. Yeah. I feel like that's the kind of central, there were the other things as well that you mentioned with the other kids and the more coming of age stuff. But for me, like that felt like the central gaze of the movie, like it was searching through this pre-established memory, but it was now like it was a completely irrelevant memory, or it seemed like one at the time, and it's recorded as such. But now, like later in life, to her, it feels significant in a way that she doesn't fully understand and that she wants to reach back into and to find that understanding, basically. Yeah. And I really like that. I just really like that kind of filmmaking. It feels like pure cinema in a way also, in the sense that I can't see any other medium handle these kinds of memory questions as well as film can, with the way it can construct visually and can kind of cut back and forth in time and between the real and the imagined and that sort of stuff. Maybe let's get more specifically into the journey that Sophie goes on, or the sort of quest, I guess, that's present in this movie. Because if we take that premise that this is adult Sophie looking back into her past to find some understanding about who her father was, or maybe what he was struggling with that caused him to not be in her life anymore. Like, what's your initial take on what happened there? What was the father like? What was he struggling with? And what do you think happened after the vacation?
Yeah.
If you haven't had a chance yet to check out Aftersun, no worries, it's showing exclusively on Mubi in many countries including the UK, Italy, Latin America, and many others. As you probably already know, Mubi is an online streaming service showing hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe that both Thomas and I are big fans of. Besides Aftersun, they have an extensive library that is great both for newcomers wanting to explore the richness of cinema, as well as for the veteran cinephiles in search for hidden gems. Every film is carefully selected, so you just know you're always going to be watching something special. As a friend of the podcast, Mubi kindly agreed to sponsor this episode, which is why we can happily offer you 30 days of Mubi for free by going to mubi.com/cinemaofmeaning, or by just following the link in the show notes. So be sure to claim your extended free trial to watch Aftersun and to start exploring some good cinema. Now back to the show.
All of this you kind of piece together as you're going, but he seems like he is currently struggling. At first you get the sense that maybe there was something in his past that he was struggling with, and then kind of as it progresses you get the sense that he's still kind of very much presently struggling with. Most likely depression seems to be the best clues that we get.
You mean present in the memory, or in the holiday?
Yeah, in the holiday. I think one of the pivotal scenes is one where Sophie is laying on the bed upside down and her dad asks her if she's okay. And she kind of starts talking about this feeling that she has in her bones that essentially, in my mind, describes what depression feels like, or symptoms of depression. His response to this is basically he's unable to engage in it, but then we're also seeing him kind of off to the side in the mirror, and he spits on his own reflection with he's brushing his teeth or something, I think. And he's just kind of like, come on, let's go have some fun, or go, they leave and they go do something else. But that's kind of one of the central clues we get there. And then there's a lot of other details. But to me, it seems like he's obviously someone who has struggled with, depression, possibly substance abuse related to that, or alcoholism. There's talk of drugs later on. And he's kind of, when we see him during the vacation, he's sort of really struggling to try to overcome this and grapple with this and be there and be present as a father. He has books on Tai Chi. He's doing Tai Chi outside. He has a book about meditation that's kind of sitting there. So we see these clues that he's kind of like at this place where he's trying to get a handle on things. He's trying to get a grip on things.
He has like no inner peace.
But yeah. And he has no inner peace, but he's also like desperately fighting to like gain some and hold on to it. And he's struggling with his past. There's stuff about his birthday, which is kind of triggering to him. He tells this story. So we know there's like, abusive history or bad history with his family, or just details there that, are kind of triggering to him.
Yeah. And he talked about not feeling like he belonged in the place he grew up in.
Yes.
He was originally from Scotland, but I think they now lived somewhere else.
Yeah.
England, or
So you have that, And then I think like kind of the climactic tension or drama that we're seeing within the film is this. And I think this is what relates to sort of the detail of Sophie, old Sophie being a parent now, is what Callum is really kind of struggling with is this sense of trying to get a handle on these things and wanting to have a handle on those things so he can be there for his daughter. But the ways in which he's failing at that really like kicks into gear this like sense of self-loathing or something that's happening internally in him, or just a feeling of like lack of being in control. And that was kind of what was really resonating with me, would be like the deep sorrow and also anger that you might feel as a parent if you had struggled all your life with severe depression or something like that. And then you had your own kid, and you still are, and you're still like desperately trying to work through this. And then your own child is laying there on the bed, like describing what that feels like to you. And you'd just be like, oh no, my kid who I love is going to be doomed to grapple with this terrible thing that I've been dealing with. But because I'm still grappling with it, like I can't even be there to provide the solution or answers to that scenario. That was kind of my read on like what the central tension is. I don't know if you felt the same way or have anything.
I had a few thoughts that were just my interpretation of what happened.
Yeah.
Just to put it out there directly, like as far as I'm concerned, I thought he killed himself at some point.
I did think that as well too. Yeah.
There's some shots that suggest an eventual suicide. Like there's one shot of Callum standing on the balcony on like the railing.
Yeah.
And then there's the more obvious shot of him diving into the ocean and apparently not coming out, as you have this interesting sound effect where the waves, or the sound of the waves, it goes like louder and louder and louder. And to me, it reminded me of that shot in Dunkirk where you have a similar moment where like this desperate soldier just walks into the ocean and disappears. That to me hinted at at least at suicidal thoughts, or an actual suicide that might have occurred later in Sophie's life and later in his life, I guess.
There was a brief moment where I actually thought that might be happening. Watching it the first time, I was like, is he, just walking into the ocean?
I had the same thing,
bracing myself for it to be like a really brutal movie. It still is very heavy, but it doesn't quite go all the way there.
Yeah, for a second I had the same feeling, like did he just leave Sophie there in Turkey as he wandered off into the ocean? But I feel I'm kind of glad it was a metaphorical shot, but I think it still suggests it was Sophie's imagining her father's struggles with suicidal thoughts during that vacation. I also think there were hints at his struggle with his sexuality. We see Sophie is explicitly revealed as a lesbian or gay woman. She's in a relation with another woman. So to me, that was really interesting because there's some hints in the vacation too. There's Caleb. He kind of lives up when he's talking with that other guy on the boat who fixes his flipper or something. That's, for me at least, the one time where you see him kind of not enthusiastic, but more engaged in conversation with someone who is not Sophie. And there's a little, I'm not sure if that was intentional, but it feels like there's a itsy bitsy tiny like Freudian slip where the moment he's talking to Sophie about, he says something along the lines of, oh, you're gonna go to parties, meet boys, do drugs. And then at the end of it he says like, I've done it all. And then it, it seems to refer to like the drugs part, but he does mention, it might be like a throwaway thing or little detail, but, and I think there was a moment where Sophie does see two other guys make out at some point.
Yes.
Where at first I also thought that might be her father because one of the guys was kind of in the shadows. Right. Now I don't think I think they were just two unrelated guys, but the sexuality question does feel like it's kind of planted throughout. And that might of course be Sophie struggling with her own sexuality and maybe not directly also being her father's struggle.
Right.
But at the same time, the other interpretation that I think is just as interesting is this, that doesn't know anything about her father's sexuality, besides him just probably being straight, as is kind of the norm, but that she's kind of projecting it onto him in order to find something to lash onto, like, oh, yes, she knows, like, she obviously or probably struggled with her sexuality at some point, and so she might imagine that her father could have been going through the same thing, even though she didn't know it, which would explain some of his depression or some of his issues that he had during that vacation or generally in his life.
There's a lot of imagery of reflection, mirrors. We see them in television screens and kind of like Calum and Sophie reflected together. And so I think there's obviously a scene there of at least, or a theme throughout the film of at least grappling with, to what extent is Sophie a reflection of him, and what are the similarities and what are the differences? And so I definitely can see that as a theme. There's also obviously the father isn't with Sophie's mother anymore, and we don't know why. We never get those details, but it seems like their separation was very amicable in a way. Sophie asked at one point why they say "I love you" to each other. So there's some history there in terms of their separation that is more complicated than just they didn't like each other or something like that. We don't get quite all the details enough to, I think, fill in this kind of sense of objectively what was going on, but we definitely get a lot of impressions of different things that might be his own struggle.
Yeah. And one thing I also thought was really interesting, I'm not curious to hear what you thought about it, is there's this scene where they visit this carpet store.
Yes.
And then the carpet is super expensive, like 850 pounds, which I think is a lot. And then there's later a memory where the father goes back on his own to actually buy one. And it's this kind of weird scene where he's kind of seen sleeping his head at the side of like a stack of carpets, and then he buys one and he just lays down on top of it. I'm pretty sure that's also the same carpet that we later see in Sophie's apartment as an adult.
Yeah, I agree.
But at the same time, there's this kind of through line of Calum not having any money to spend, basically, that he's, Sophie asks him about a kind of business idea that he's setting up, and he's kind of wishy-washy about it. Like, he has an idea, but he hasn't figured it out, and it kind of feels very vague. There's that moment where the other kids have these all-inclusive wristbands, and that they clearly don't have, which to me suggested that they were there at like a lower tier of guests, like one of the cheaper rooms without full access to the bar and everything. There's that moment at the end where Sophie does the karaoke, and then the father is like, oh, we should get you singing lessons. And Sophie kind of laments him for, just stop spending money that you don't have.
Yeah.
All that had me questioning, like, did he actually buy the carpet for Sophie, or is that maybe Sophie's imagination again, trying to like imagine what it was like if her father had bought it for her, or did he literally buy it for her? But is she now just realizing like at what actual cost that came, like that she's just now as an adult realizing that he sacrificed like so much money for what is essentially like a luxury item, even though he's struggling at like the base level of his being. Like maybe that was a part of his struggles, that he was just really bad with money. I'm not sure if that's something that got your attention or...
Yeah, well, I noticed the rug stuff and the themes about money, and I think my read was mostly just, I think he wasn't responsible with it and didn't know, he's just kind of stuck in this place of not... I read it kind of as he buys it for himself and then she ends up with it at the end. But it's also kind of, he sits up there for a long time looking at it. It feels like he's really kind of mulling over whether or not to buy it. I think it's also just an extension of this weird way in which he's, or not that weird, but this way in which he's kind of grasping for finding meaning in whatever he can, where he falls in love with kind of, basically a piece of art, essentially. I mean, it has utility, but he kind of falls in love with it to the point where he spends a lot of time looking at it while Sophie is off doing something else. And then he comes back to get it. I don't know what the specific meaning is there, but obviously like Sophie has, I think that's one of the points of tension maybe, where there's frustration looking back on things with how he was behaving, not just in the kind of leaving her abandoned the one night. That's the thing he does that's most explicitly sort of like bad or hurtful to her. Yeah. He also doesn't do the karaoke and kind of is maybe from her perspective is saying things that are a little bit mean. But outside of those, he's not doing anything that is kind of explicitly wrong necessarily, like at least that we see in the context of the vacation, except for maybe just being like not very responsible with money, just kind of being.
Yeah, he is trying.
He is trying.
Concerned about the sunscreen, and
yes,
he's very protective of Sophie generally, and he just feels like he's coming up a bit short at certain moments. But then he also immediately apologizes for her, like he's not being toxic towards her. He knows like whatever issues he has are kind of taking place within his own interiority, and so he knows. I feel like he has a good sense, like whenever he lets his issues affect Sophie, that he knows when that line has been crossed, and that's when he apologizes. And that's maybe also why Sophie has that sensation that there's like some inner struggle that her father is occasionally revealing like a glimpse of, and then which now as an adult kind of struggling to get a sense of what exactly that was.
Yeah.
But there's a few other details like that. There's the one I'm not sure what it was about, where they go visit like this bath thing.
Yeah.
And Callum has like this injury on his shoulder suddenly, like this scrape, which they kind of make a point of mentioning, but I didn't catch anything about what happened there or what that was supposed to mean. Or
I think that was just the day after he was off on his own for a long time and kind of blackout drunk. So either he knows where he got it and he's lying about, or he's just lying and saying he doesn't know, or he literally doesn't remember because he just roughed up somehow the night before while he was, because we see him walk into the ocean, and then Sophie eventually finds her way back into the room. She's stuck outside without a room key for a while. She gets back in, and then he's just laying there like naked on the bed, and we have no idea what happens between those two things. So I think it was just something that happened in there that we never
made a little metaphor for kind of this self-harm, or that he was engaged in some self-wounding act.
Behavior that is physically harmful to himself and
mentally probably as well. Yeah.
And mentally,
Let's move towards the ending then, maybe. I think, or unless you had more, I feel like we've covered pretty much the
meat of the story. I was feeling ready to move that direction anyway, because one connection I wanted to make, and maybe this will move us in that direction, is I think what you described as kind of being the sympathetic view we get of the father, as being he's stuck in his own problems to some degree, and he has these things that he's dealing with, and there's certain behavior that he exhibits that is kind of inappropriate towards or irresponsible as a father. But then, like you said, he apologizes, and he does seem to be really trying. It doesn't treat him in its gaze for the most part as a hostile entity. It treats him in like a kind of loving, sympathetic way. And that leads us towards sort of this climactic moment where there's this realm, I guess I'll call it.
Yeah.
There's a dance floor with strobing lights that, to my mind, doesn't, I think, exist in reality. It's sort of this metaphorical space within memory. Yeah. And there's a scene where Sophie and the father dance together on the vacation, and this is intercut with a scene of adult Sophie dancing with the father. And that's kind of cuts back and forth between this strobing dance floor and this real, or quote unquote, real dance that happens on the vacation. What was your take on kind of that stuff, and then how sort of the movie concludes?
I found that to be a really emotionally moving scene, even though I did not initially or directly understand what happened, but I felt the way the movie does a lot of things or interesting things with its sound design as well. And here too, we have, I think it's Under Pressure from Queen, if I'm not mistaken, which is the song that's playing, but it's kind of warped and remixed at certain moments. But yeah, I think I had a hard time to kind of make out what exactly was happening in the, let's call it the metaphorical space, the dance floor with the strobing lights, because it was just so...
Strobing, yeah.
Yeah, so much strobing going on. I felt like it was a simultaneous outpouring of anger that she may have felt, like a sort of combination of anger and grief, like, why did you leave me, or why are you, basically that, why did you leave me, I think is what it comes down to, while simultaneously trying to hold on to him, which we see especially in the real dance sequence where she ends up embracing him, but in the metaphorical space, it feels like she's ultimately unable to. She kind of pushes him off and he falls down, and we see the strobing image of adult Sophie, and then it quickly cuts into young Sophie smiling. So that I'm not sure if it's supposed to have like this intellectual breakdown of this shot means this and now it means this. But for me, like the emotion at the heart of it was more the simultaneous kind of trying to push away because, there's hurt and grief and pain there, while also trying to hold on to the good things and the love and the connection, and just that tension, the kind of that struggle is, to me, was what that scene was about.
Yeah, I agree. I think the clearest thing conveyed there is the emotion, and what I found so impactful about that, I think, was how it conveyed and then kind of held the complexity of emotion that exists, or it feels like exists in this, where it's not just, oh, he was a bad dad, I'm mad at him, I don't want anything to do with him, or, oh, I forgive you, everything's good, I love you, it's all just fine, it's like all of those things are kind of coexisting at once in this fragmented mess, and there's not really a resolution to that. It just kind of those things just kind of have to exist and be there. And yeah, I just love how that was conveyed emotionally and visually, and I think it speaks to such a reality of emotion in the real world that films all often have a difficulty of kind of conveying, because most movies, they progress towards a specific emotional beat that often is very clear in its specific kind of emotion, like, oh, you feel sad now, or you feel excited in victory, or something. So I'm always interested whenever a filmmaker can make me feel like 2 or 3 different things at once and then just like leave them all on the table.
Yeah.
But then we also see after that scene, there's a little bit of a scene where they are separating at some kind of travel. I don't know if it's an airport or bus station or something. Sophie's walking off. Callum is recording with the videotape, kind of her leaving. Then it cuts to present day Sophie with that same video recorder watching this footage, which we already saw hints to earlier, but this kind of shows us.
Yeah, that she's explicitly watching the VHS tape that the previous scene just cut on. Yeah.
And I think that's where we see that she has the rug as well. She has this VHS tape, which was left in his hand. Like, wasn't her VHS tape recorder, it was his. And then it kind of cuts back to him standing there. We see him, and he turns around and walks down this hallway, this very weird sort of empty hallway. And at the end of it are doors, and he goes through them. And on the other side of the doors is that dance floor with the strobing lights. And that to me were the biggest indicators that he's dead. We don't know exactly what happened or when, but it very much seems like he's separated somehow into another space. And like that version of him exists in that liminal space, whatever it is. And now real world Sophie has his stuff, like the recorder and the rug. So it seems pretty clear that like something happened, kind of separating them.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the same. I liked, initially I thought that if it would not have been better if the movie ended on, because you go from the dance scene to VHS footage of Sophie at
Right.
the travel place. And then there's a freeze frame where there's a last smile before she disappears out of sight. And that's where the VHS pauses. And I initially thought that maybe that was going to be
The ending.
the final shot.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, you get this, it kind of pans towards the right and the camera pans around, and then it's revealed that the freeze frame is actually on a TV and the TV is actually being watched by Sophie. Then it kind of even further and it hits this white wall, which then transitions into the white wall that marks the hallway that you mentioned, and we get the imagined shot of her father then kind of just ending the videotape, putting his camera away and walking away, as you said. Yeah, I just liked the way that was constructed, that we get this simultaneous, the captured memory, like the objective reality, the present day reality, and then a sort of imagined reality, and then that little hint at the end with the completely detached space. It's sort of all in one there. But yeah, as to, I'm not sure if I have anything to add on it, to what you just said about it. It does feel like that, as you said, like he's now out of this realm into that other space. That's where he exists, and she only has the artifacts of what he left behind, like the camera, and maybe also in that final shot, like the intention of what he was trying to, why he had that camera in the first place, like why was he filming her, and maybe what was he trying to capture for himself. And maybe she imagines that maybe that, like that final shot is then what he brought along with him as he went away into the strobing light space. I'm not sure where exactly this was in the movie. There's a shot at some point of a postcard that's from her dad to Sophie, and that says something that no matter what happens, I will always love you, or something in that direction. To me, may have suggested that there is at least some consolation that whatever her dad was going through, at least Sophie was not a burden, but actually like a point of hope or a kind of a point of light for him, instead of like that, if anything, that Sophie made him hold on longer than he would have if she had not existed, which I think that's a small comfort there in that ending.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what exactly the context of that was. That shot of the postcard comes immediately after a shot of him sitting on the bed sobbing. It's hard to place exactly where those are supposed to be happening in time, because they happen, I think, like right before the dance or after it. Either way, they're like interspersed towards the end where the vacation is kind of coming to an end. It doesn't seem like those shots are happening within the linear narrative of the vacation narrative. So I don't know if those were from earlier, maybe it's hard to tell exactly what that might be, but we at least get the feeling of that. Yeah, and I don't think I could expound on that beyond what you said. It's a nice ambiguous ending in that you have enough clues, I think, to piece together kind of the details of probably what happened, but you also get a little bit of that unresolved feeling that certainly Sophie would be carrying in this situation. And I think it balances those things really well, kind of in how it comes together at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's also the point, to have that ambiguity, that kind of to show that maybe whatever is unresolved in the past will probably be unresolved forever.
Yeah.
Like it would, like in a more conventional story, this would probably have ended with Sophie discovering some distinct clue that would, sort of like, Interstellar, not to spoil it, but there's that moment at the end where she finds the watch of her father, and it's like this distinct and like definitive revelation about the nature of her relation to her father, or what her father felt about him. Now that I think of it, there's actually a pretty strong parallel between these two movies in that sense. But with the difference being that this is obviously a more realistic take, where there isn't that moment of explicit catharsis or explicit revelation, and so she's just has to do with what she's given, like the little pieces, and kind of construct her own narrative, and then have that be enough, or find some way to be at peace with that. And I really liked it. To me, that's what made it feel more true to life and more emotionally complex and engaging. And yeah, I've seen it twice now, and I have not been able to really like shake it off, even though I've seen other movies in between. This is one that's still lingering quite a bit.
It was one, I watched it again yesterday, right before we recorded this, but I really wouldn't have had to, because I think my experience of it the first time, even though the first time I watched it was over a month ago, and I've watched a bunch of movies in between, it was so kind of visceral in sort of how it affected me, or like how it lingered with me, that it's one of those movies it stops, and then you kind of carry it and its implications out of the experience of watching the movie. And at least for me, it really provokes kind of thinking about a lot of the things we discussed in the first half of this episode about how you relate to your own past, your own parents, or your own memories, just the nature of the complexity of emotions we deal with when we look back on those things.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month, that was James Cameron's Avatar 2, The Way of Water. Before that, we've also covered the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Upstream Color, Alien Covenant, Drive, and many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.